August of 2020 will earmark the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, the amendment that granted women the right to vote in the United States. But with such a big cultural change, there's a lot of history that tends to go behind it that doesn't normally get talked about. And so in that video, we're going to correct that wrong. In today's episode, we'll be covering the history of women's suffrage in the United States. The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified on August the 18th of 1920. This amendment prevented anyone's right to vote from being infringed due to gender, and it guaranteed that women had the right to vote in the United States. Yet this amendment didn't come about without any groundwork already in place. Many states had already given women the right to vote prior to 1920, at least in some capacity, and we'll be covering that in this video. But please do keep in mind that this is an extremely extensive topic, so I'll not be able to go into detail for everything, otherwise I'd be looking at a multiple-hour video, so again, just keep that in mind while watching. While information isn't terribly concrete, women and some black individuals had the ability to vote in most, if not all, of the 13 colonies, at least prior to independence. However, there were the typical caveats. They had to be free inhabitants of the state/colony, they had to be over the age of majority, and they had to have more than 50 pounds of wealth to their name, which equates to roughly $11,000 nowadays. And there are also additional hurdles depending on the state, but the monetary requirements were the biggest hurdle, as by the laws at the time, any married woman couldn't own anything herself, as all possessions were in her husband's name. It also removed the ability for many poor individuals to vote, as the standard wage per day would only be around 1/10 of a pound, assuming I did my calculations correctly, which I normally don't. So while women technically had the right to vote, the circumstances surrounding it made it rather rare. Once the American Revolution occurred, women became a rather important part of the war effort, both in material and political ways. And while most didn't expect equality per se after the war, many did expect greater female representation from the new government. Yet that didn't happen. The exact opposite happened, actually. When the colonies declared independence and became states, they were able to write their own state constitutions, and pretty much every state wrote in laws that directly forbid women from being able to vote in that state, no matter the circumstances. New York would be the first in 1777, then Massachusetts and New Hampshire in 1780, and almost all other states before the end of the Revolution. Once again, it was hoped by some that the matter of women's suffrage would be decided by the federal government, but yet again that hope was quickly dashed. During the U.S. Constitutional Convention in mid-1787, it granted each state the ability to write its own voting requirements, so all states, save one, listed that only white men had the ability to vote in their state. The one state that didn't was the state of New Jersey. Yeah, New Jersey. In its 1790 Constitution, it granted all free individuals the ability to vote regardless of gender or race, but they still needed to reach that income requirement as stated previously. But even with that hurdle, upwards of around 10,000 women voted in New Jersey for the handful of years that they were able to. Yet this would be changed by the start of the 19th century. Following Republican Thomas Jefferson's victory over Federalist John Adams in the 1800 presidential election, the Federalists came to believe that female voters benefited the Republican cause. More Republicans lived in towns, and it was easier to engage voters in urban areas than the more spread out rural areas of the states. Federalists thus thought that female disenfranchisement would limit the number of votes that Republican candidates would receive without hurting their own party. This push for disenfranchisement was pushed by bullshit arguments that women were poorly suited for political participation and that they didn't have the mental faculties to understand political matters. As New Jersey was still a Federalist stronghold, its constitution got modified in 1807, one that would limit the ability to vote to only adult white males. It would be 3 decades before any real movement on women's voting rights occurred in the United States. Kentucky would be the first to give sorta kinda statewide suffrage in 1838, but with more asterisks attached to it than being a member of the European Union. It allowed female heads of the House in rural communities to vote in elections decided on taxes and local school boards for public schooling, with women in the cities of Louisville, Lexington, and Maysville being exempt, because these cities already had public school boards in them. Elsewhere in the country, women became a very vocal part in the anti-slavery movement in the United States, with many propping up in the 1830s. By 1837, female anti-slavery societies had become numerous and strong enough that they held their first national convention in New York City, preceded by Maria Weston Chapman. These societies and conventions would continue to grow in size as call for emancipation grew across the country, and many so-called radicals at the time would find allies within these circles, who would later come back to aid them in their time of need. A number of women were present during the first National Anti-Slavery Convention in London that happened in 1840, although they were not allowed to vote or speak, but even still, their mere presence signaled a small amount of change that would gradually expand. In 1848, New York and Pennsylvania passed laws that were pushed by citizen initiatives, known as the Married Women's Property Act. This act would give women the right to retain the property that they brought into a marriage, as well as any property that they acquired during the marriage, effectively separating the predisposition of married women being unable to own wealth. The same year, 1848, saw the first female rights convention being held in Seneca Falls, New York, which was a Quaker hotspot. The particular group of Quakers in the area had long held to the belief of equality between men and women. A group of 5 Quaker women called for a convention to take place on July the 18th. The convention itself drew an audience of nearly 400 during the 2 days of attendance. From this time, many more women's suffrage conventions would take place across the US, with them growing in numbers as they continued on an annual basis. Many women would attempt to vote in various states during the 1850s as well. However, they were pretty much all ignored and their ballots were tossed, with some even being arrested. Well-known names would appear during this time, such as Susan B. Anthony, Victoria Woodhull, and a handful of others. However, this expansion in public support would be put on hold as war began to brew in the nation. As the American Civil War raged, many suffrage supporters put aside their calls and supported the war, with the focus being towards slave emancipation for the 4 years of the conflict. While the majority of suffrage supporters went this route, a faction led largely by Susan B. Anthony continued to push the national government for greater women's rights in the middle of the war, but once again they came up largely empty. After the Civil War, the abolition and women's rights movements continued to work together, now in a combined organization. This organization was dubbed the American Equal Rights Association in an attempt to promote universal suffrage for both blacks and women alike. They hired African American women speakers such as Louisa Matilda Jacobs to speak to audiences around New York State, and beyond that to convince them of the need for black men and all women to have the right to vote. 3 amendments passed and ratified post the Civil War would heavily disrupt the unity that the universal suffrage move had, though. A rift between the abolitionist and women's suffrage faction would grow from the 15th Amendment and its passage. Many predominant women's suffrage supporters rallied against the passing of the 14th and 15th Amendment, As while it granted black men the ability to vote, it didn't grant black women or white women that same ability. Divided over whether to support these advances for African American men at the expense of all women, the American Equal Rights Association split into two groups in 1869. The National Women's Suffrage Association, which was headquartered in New York by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and the other group was the American Women's Suffrage Association, headquartered in Boston by Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell. This split marks a difference in ideology. The NWSA opposed the 15th Amendment, which was giving the black men the right to vote, unless all women were included, while the AWSA championed it. This also showed a more marked difference between two as to how they aimed to bring about change. Anthony and Stanton had aimed to change the state's constitutions individually to bring about greater change. The latter group, headed by Stone, wanted to change it directly at the federal level, establishing a political party with suffrage as its primary platform and winning support that way. Yet, while infighting occurred within the national parties, a small spark of change would occur in the far, far west, far away from the eyes of the many in the east. The Western territories in particular were a bit more open to the idea of women's suffrage at the time. The Washington Territory proposed a bill in 1854, Nebraska would in 56, and the Dakotas would in 69. And while all of these failed, the Dakota won by a single vote, it did show a big change in that side of the nation, and it shouldn't be surprising that the first territory to grant women's suffrage would be from the region, albeit it was passed for all the wrong reasons. To go further into the story, we will be looking at this man, William Bright, a saloon keeper from South Pass City in Wyoming, a frontier mining town nearly as big as Cheney at the time. In the fall of 1868, General Ulysses S. Grant was elected president, and shortly after the start of his tenure, Grant would appoint a man to run the brand new Wyoming Territory. These federal picks included the governor John Campbell, Campbell's second in command Edward Lee, and Attorney General Joseph A. Carey, the top government lawyer in the state. They arrived in May of 1869, and not long afterward, Carey issued an official legal opinion that no one in Wyoming could be denied the right to vote based on race, something that had yet to be specifically recognized in the territory. William Bright would be one of the 22 legislators that got elected to the territorial legislature in September of 1869, with Campbell having a full legislature that was of an opposing party of his own. However, the political divide was still concerning to many in the legislature, as Governor Campbell aimed to enshrine that black individuals would have their rights to vote protected in the territory, which was extremely unpopular within the state chamber. To counter this, the legislature pushed a different idea. Instead of expanding black rights, they would aim to expand women's rights. They passed a law guaranteeing that teachers, most of them that were women, were paid the same whether they were a man or a woman, and they also passed a bill that guaranteed married women property rights that were separate from their husbands. As explained previously, many women's suffrage supporters were also large proponents of the abolition of slavery, and in many cases vice versa. However, after the Civil War, a significantly greater focus was being shifted into doing what was possible to make sure the freed slaves got the right to vote and were able to keep it, with women's rights being put on the back burner. This infuriated a number of suffrage supporters, and this anger was tapped by third parties to get the suffrage supporters on their side. To this end, William Bright, fairly late in the session, introduced a bill to give Wyoming women the right to vote. Unfortunately, no record was kept of what the Wyoming lawmakers actually said while they were debating the bill, but what was on Bright's mind and on the other legislators' mind can be gleaned from newspaper articles and from people's memoirs reported years later. The reason they were in support of this was that lawmakers wanted to give Wyoming some good publicity so that more settlers would come to the territory. With the Transcontinental Railroad built and the gold mines at South Pass producing less and less gold, it seemed as though more people were leaving than coming in, and positive news stories published throughout the nation, legislators thought, might reverse the trend. The lawmakers especially hoped that the news would bring more single women into the territory, as there were 6 adult men for every adult woman, and there were very few children being born at the time. The lawmakers were also hopeful that Campbell would veto the bill, and that in turn would result in his downfall. In the State House, lawmakers tried and failed to attach various amendments. Some of these were attempts to make the bill so unattractive to the other legislators that it would fail. One such amendment which did fail would have extended the vote to all people of color, albeit in not so friendly language. The House did pass an amendment to raise the voting age for women from 18 to 21, and they also passed the women's suffrage bill 7 votes to 4 with 1 abstention. Governor Campbell took several days to decide what to do, and he finally signed the bill into law on December 10th of 1869, with a woman by the name of Esher Morris being appointed as a judge of peace in early 1870, the first woman to hold a political office in the United States. Upwards of around 1,000 women voted in the 1871 elections, and while a repeal of their ability to vote got on the governor's desk, it was vetoed, and thus Wyoming kept the ability for women to vote, but they would not be the only territory for long. Another Western territory, this time being Utah, would shortly after grant women suffrage, but for different reasons. The area was largely inhabited by members of the Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as Mormons, after they were chased out of the Midwest some years previous. The official stance in D.C. was that one of the core religious tenets of the Saints' religion needed to be removed, that being polygamy. After slavery was abolished and black men gained voting rights in the 15th Amendment, many American reformers turned their attention from ending slavery to ending polygamy. Initially, some believed giving Utah women voting rights would politically empower them to end the practice, and the Latter-day Saints, on the other hand, believed that Mormon women would use their vote to show their support for the practice. They also thought giving women the right to vote would change the negative perceptions about the church and its treatment of women, and wanted to show that Mormon women were not oppressed, helpless, and enslaved as many believed. Finally, granting suffrage to women would strengthen support for the People's Party, a Utah political party recently organized by Mormons in opposition to the new Liberal Party, which was formed by non-Mormon settlers whose numbers were increasing in the territory. On February the 12th of 1870, Utah's acting governor John Schaffer, damn what a last name, a staunch anti-Mormonist, signed a women's suffrage bill that had unanimously passed the territorial legislature. This law granted voting rights in local and territorial elections for women, but not the right to run for or hold public office. Gaining the vote broadened Utah women's opportunities to participate in political life, however, and leaders from the Relief Society, which was the women's organization of the Latter-day Saints Church, developed programs to educate women about the political process and civic engagement, electing women to national conventions for women's suffrage. However, since giving Utah women the ability to vote did not end polygamy, anti-polygamists lobbied the U.S. Congress to pass laws pressuring the church to disavow polygamy, and it was the one sticking issue in preventing Utah from becoming a state. Several proposed anti-polygamy bills were also included measures to revoke women's suffrage, and Congress would eventually pass the Edmunds-Tucker Act in 1887, with part of this legislation taking away the voting rights of all Utah women, whether they were Mormon or not, monogamous or polygamous, etc. And this was essentially enforced on the territory, Yet this still wouldn't be the end of changing suffrage for Utah. In 1890, LDS Church President Wilford Woodruff officially ended the practice of polygamy. With this change in policy, Congress would once again invite Utah to the Union as a state, and during Utah's 1895 Constitutional Convention, delegates debated whether to include women's suffrage and the right to hold public office into the state's constitution. In contrast to other parts of the nation, most supported a woman's right to vote and to hold public office, with both national parties in Utah supporting these rights in their party platforms. Despite minor opposition, the delegates voted to include a clause in the Constitution that granted women suffrage and the right to hold public office. A few months later, Utah's male electorate voted overwhelmingly to approve the Constitution, and Utah women were given back the right to vote when Congress accepted Utah's Constitution and granted Utah statehood in 1896. Progress for women's suffrage did keep expanding at this point. In 1893, a referendum in Colorado made that state the second one to give women suffrage and the first state where the men voted to give women the right to vote. A few years later, Idaho approved a constitutional amendment with a statewide vote giving women the right to vote, bringing the number up to 4 states. One after another, Western states granted the right of voting to their female citizens, with the only opposition being presented by the liquor interests and the machine politicians. Oregon passed women's suffrage in 1912, and Montana voted to end the discrimination against women in 1914, with them proceeding to elect the first female to the United States Congress in 1916 by the name of Jeannette Rankin. Arizona became a state in 1912, but it had many more conservative Southerners, and its new constitution did not include women's suffrage. Activists in the state would form the Arizona Equal Suffrage Association and launched a campaign to win that vote. Their tactics were to reach out to progressive organizations for endorsements, winning the support of influential political and civic leaders. The AESA sent delegations to the Republican and Democratic state conventions to argue for their support. This tactic would eventually work, and women's suffrage was added on in the general election that was held on November the 5th of 1912. California approved suffrage in 1911 and had the first Chinese American women voting. Yet suffrage wouldn't extend too far east, at least not yet. Illinois was the first state to the east of the Mississippi River to give women the right to vote in 1913, but they were limited to presidential elections and local elections, not being able to vote for any state Congress members or governors. Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio would pass similar bills by 1916, with Arkansas passing a bill that allowed women to only vote in primaries, but not the general elections. Now, with all these states granting women the right to vote in some capacity, some may wonder what was the driving factor behind this expansion of suffrage. In 1900, Carrie Chapman Catt succeeded Susan B. Anthony as the president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Catt revitalized the organization, turning the focus of it to the passage of the federal amendment, while simultaneously supporting women who wanted to pressure their states to pass suffrage legislation. The strategy had several goals, with women in the states that already granted presidential suffrage would focus on passing a federal suffrage amendment. Women who believed they could influence their state legislators would focus on amending their state constitutions, and southern states would focus on gaining primary suffrage. Simultaneously, the organization worked to elect congressmen who supported suffrage for women. By 1915, there were a large, powerful organization with 44 state chapters and over 2 million members. When World War I started, women in 8 states had already won the right to vote, but support for the federal amendment was still rather weak. When the US officially entered World War I, Kat made the controversial decision to support the war effort, despite the widespread pacifist sentiment of many of her colleagues and supporters. As women joined the labor force to replace men that were serving in the military, NAWSA organizers argued that women's sacrifices made them deserving of the vote, and in 1917, the so-called Anthony Amendment was reintroduced to the House and Senate, with it being debated heavily. An offshoot women's suffrage organization called the National Woman's Party protested outside of the White House for weeks at a time, demanding universal suffrage. Eventually, over 150 would be arrested, and they were only released from prison due to public pressure. In 1918, President Wilson faced a difficult midterm election and would have to confront the issue of women's suffrage directly. 15 states had extended equal voting rights to women, and by this time, Wilson himself supported the federal amendment. The House of Representatives would pass the proposal by one vote, and while Wilson made a speech for the amendment in the Senate, it failed by 2 votes. For 6 months, the proposal would be brought before the House and the Senate 5 different times, each time just barely failing. But finally, in the June of 1919, the Senate passed the proposal, 56 in favor, 25 against, and now it would be up to the states to ratify it before it got added to the Constitution. Kat and the National Woman's Party set to work trying to push states to ratify the amendment, 3 of which were signed on in less than a week. By August of 1920, the required number of states had ratified the amendment, and thus the 19th Amendment was officially codified into the US Constitution, putting this chapter of history somewhat to rest.